Will the Committee of Supply please come to order? This section of the Committee of Supply will now resume consideration of the estimates for the Department of Environment, Climate, and Parks. Questioning for this department will continue on a global manner. The floor is now open for questions. The member for Wolseley.
Hello again, Minister. Last week, I had started to ask about your department's process of developing an energy policy for the Manitoba government, and if you could now talk about the scope of the energy policy, and if this policy will include Crown corporations like Manitoba Hydro.
The Honourable Minister for Environment, Climate, and Parks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and her team, and certainly great to be here to talk about energy today on this beautiful sunny fall afternoon. And to the question on energy strategy and Crown's involvement, absolutely, particularly Manitoba Hydro and Efficiency Manitoba have been and continue to be at the table when it comes to Dunsky that we spoke about last week, leading the strategy, of course. Dunsky, well recognized, certainly offer the member to look up their history and their record. They operate in several states along with Canada as well, in several provinces and territories. So great record and looking forward to, again, continuing to work with them, particularly when it comes to hydro, for instance, the Integrated Resource Plan, or the IRP. This strategy will help form that IRP as they go forward too as well. We know how important an integrated resource plan is for Manitoba Hydro. They've never had one, and they will have one, and a lot of it will be driven out of the energy strategy and Dunsky's report, of course, which we're looking forward to releasing later on this year. And also Efficiency Manitoba, as you know, and the member probably knows, that there's a 3-year plan currently in place with Efficiency Manitoba. The energy strategy will also help develop the next 3-year plan for Efficiency Manitoba as they go forward, with the process of, again, on conserving energy, but also working with Manitobans and industry to ensure that we get to that path that we need to be with reducing our energy consumption. So I'll leave that for now and look forward to your next question.
The member for Wolseley.
Thank you. Can the minister explain if there will be greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets as part of the energy policy?
The Honourable Minister of Environment, Climate and Parks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank the member for the question. And again, Dunsky's report really focuses in on 5 main areas that they're leaning towards, and we'll talk about the path to net zero shortly. But currently, the current state of energy, of course, is an area that we looked at in Manitoba, and the net zero scenario would be the second one. Innovation scan, of course, working with stakeholders on innovation and new technologies. Hydrogen feasibility study, and again, further enhanced stakeholder engagement was all part of that process. And really, it's not a target date on the path to net zero. It's really a journey on getting there. But certainly, we know that with the work that the Dunsky consultants have done in relationship with stakeholders throughout the province, we know that that path will be a lot more clear as we continue forward. And Dunsky provides us with more of an understanding, provides Manitobans with more of an understanding exactly what that path will look like.
The member for Wolseley.
Thank you. So I just want to be sure. I mean, I'm hearing talk about paths. I'm hearing you talk about net zero. Can you say for certain that there will be a greenhouse gas emission reduction target as part of the plan?
The Honourable Minister of Environment, Climate and Parks.
So thank you, Mr. Chair. So how we get there, again, is going to be rolled out in the report. You know, to say we're there in 5 years or 10 years is probably not something that we can commit to, obviously, because we haven't seen the report. But certainly we know that in the report we're looking at alternatives to, of course, gas and oil, and those are the things that we need to focus in on in order to get down that path of net zero and reduction in GHG. So, you know, geothermal heat, renewable electricity we talk about, transition to electric vehicles, which again our government is very pleased on that path as we go forward with not only electric vehicles and working with industry and alike, but also getting more charging stations available. And I know that it's an area that we in the department are focusing on, particularly in our parks, where we know that we need a reinvestment after 2 decades of no investment. As a matter of fact, reductions in our parks. We know that we need to make an investment, and inclusive of that investment, the recommendations, of course, of Manitobans, we see a path forward there with respect to charging stations. So now you take a trip up to Whiteshell. Hopefully we don't have the same spring issues that we had this year, where we can't get on our docks and our boats. I know a couple of members that from the other side have places up there, and they enjoy that beautiful Winnipeg River system, and so certainly hope they can get up there too. But if they go up to a provincial park and they want to spend the weekend and they have an electric vehicle, they'll be able to charge their vehicle, we hope, very soon too as well. So again, focusing on the transition to electric vehicles, hydrogen feasibility, geothermal, renewable electricity, these are all areas that will help set that pathway forward.
The member for Wolseley.
Thank you, Minister. I'm not hearing about specific emission reduction targets, but I will ask if the Minister or his department plan on publishing the government's energy policy publicly, and when we can expect, when the public can expect to see that plan.
The Honorable Minister of Environment, Climate, and Parks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and certainly, as I mentioned earlier on in one of my answers, we were looking towards the end of this year, calendar year, towards the later fall to have the reports made public. Of course, that's what this government does, and we intend that we're going on that path. However, we did request that Dunsky do further consultations with Indigenous folks. So we are still anticipating to have a late fall, end of calendar year release based on the information that we've been provided on the consultations, further consultations, more in-depth consultations with First Nations and Indigenous people.
The member for Wolseley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I recall a lot of energy around the original Manitoba Climate and Green Plan. So is that still guiding the work of this department, or is that old report just languishing while the minister waits the Dunsky report?
The Honorable Minister of Environment, Climate, and Parks.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and the member from Wolseley has a copy of the Manitoba Climate Green Plan. Okay, this one didn't need to be dust off because it's been working pretty hard. Let's just run through some of it just to kind of tie to your question of, is it sitting on a shelf somewhere? No, it's not sitting on a shelf. It's actually getting worked very, very hard. 4 pillars, as a matter of fact, and I know the member knows the 4 pillars. We have climate, jobs, water, and nature. And I'll just run through some of the areas for the record and for the member too as well on some of the areas that we've touched on already in the plan, of course, based on the 4 pillars. So the first one was, again, mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, and I know that the member had asked about greenhouse gas emissions as well. And the efficiency trucking program provided $5.9 million for technology and devices to improve fuel efficiency and reduce emissions. I recall that announcement made by the former minister and my colleague at, I believe it was at Gardwine, and it was an excellent opportunity for showing how private sector is being engaged in the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions as well, and really taking a lead in partnership with governments, particularly our government, to ensure that these technologies are getting implemented to help reduce that. So again, the program led to retrofitting over 2,474 units. Units like, I come from the trucking business, so I kind of have a little bit of a background on what they're doing. And they go from courier vehicles to shunt vehicles, which are vehicles they use in their yard to move trailers around, to panel vans, and right through to the big fleet, the tractor trailer units, where their tractors are actually looking at better ways, more efficient ways, and also electrifying the fleet. We know that newer technology costs a lot, but we know that the environment and us not moving will cost our environment in the long run. So we continue to do that. This particular program has reduced approximately 70,000 tons of cumulative greenhouse gas emissions while building Manitoba's expertise in clean technology in the trucking sector. The member knows we're one of the largest trucking hubs well, per capita in North America. We're the center of Canada. We have some of the largest trucking firms in the world that are stationed here, working out of Manitoba and particularly out of Winnipeg. So obviously a very, very important sector for Manitoba, for the economy and for our environment. So we're taking action along with the private sector to do that. Another area that Efficiency Manitoba established was to meet legislative targets for electricity and natural gas savings. So Manitoba and Canada have committed, again, this was an announcement that I'm sure the member's aware of $32.3 million over 3 years with the Efficiency Manitoba plan. So this is part of that plan that we talked about earlier on how Crown corporations are playing an active role in the reductions of not only the use of energy, but also moving to clean energy and also reducing greenhouse gas emissions, all in parallel. So we know that Efficiency Manitoba is looking at Manitoba's natural gas demand-side management programming, effectively doubling Efficiency Manitoba's program. So we're moving away from, Efficiency Manitoba likes to expand, and they're expanding. So what they're doing is they're moving away from residential-based support and programs to actually industrial, and moving, kind of getting out of that comfort zone that we all look at. We need to work on our residents, but we got to look at industry, because industry is playing a role, and they want to play a role, especially the private sector. So certainly we welcome that. And again, essentially, Efficiency Manitoba currently offers 35 programs across residential, industrial, commercial, and agricultural customers. There's another one, agriculture. We know we touched on ag earlier, and that plays a big part in one of the pillars as well. And I'll touch on that maybe a little bit later on, because we've still got lots of time to talk about the 4 pillars. Basically, the power sector, Manitoba has the cleanest electricity generation in Canada. Well, recently I went up to a conference in Yukon, up in Whitehorse, and all the environmental ministers from the provinces and territories met, and we were the envy of the meeting, the federal, provincial, territorial meeting, because 99.7% essentially of our grid generation is renewable sources. So what a great platform to stand on and really trumpet the fact that we're already 99.7% there. So the bar has been set. There's no doubt about
The
that.
honorable minister's time has
So much to
expired. The member for Wolseley.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate the minister wanted to use the opportunity to talk out the clock on what he perceives as the merits of the Manitoba Climate and Green Plan. My concern is that very few targets have been met, and many of those targets weren't particularly meaningful. So, and now the government is spending money to create a new plan. So will there be targets, greenhouse gas emission reduction targets specifically in the new plan that are a significant improvement on the original Manitoba Climate and Green Plan?
The Honorable Minister of Environment, Climate, and Parks.
Well, hello, Mr. Chair. Oh, pleasure to meet you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank the member for the question. And if I heard the member correctly, I believe you were referring to a new plan that's been introduced that takes us away from the original Made in Manitoba Climate Plan. I just want to be clear on that.
Member from Wolseley.
I'm referring to the Dunsky plan that you said would be released by the end of this year.
The Honorable Minister of Environment, Climate, and Parks.
Great, thanks for clearing that up. Appreciate it. As we talked about earlier, there are the 4 pillars in the plan, and the first one being climate talks about energy as well. And what I'll do is I'll provide, well, again, the member has a copy, so maybe at page 10 in the Climate and Green Plan will illustrate what I'm going to present to the table right now. So in the 4 pillars, there's actually 4 subsets of the pillars as well. So one of them is clean energy and energy strategy. In that first pillar with climate too as well, we have the carbon pricing, we have sector emissions reductions, and adaptation. So those 4 subsectors make up the climate pillar in the 4-pillar plan. The next one is jobs, of course, and we talk about jobs. It's innovation and clean tech, so good, well-paying jobs in the new clean energy sector. Financing and investment, green infrastructure, and skills and training. So those are 4 subsets of the jobs pillar in the plan. Thirdly is water, which consists again of agriculture and land use, wetlands, and watersheds, which our government is expanding on, of course. Our wetlands are important, obviously, to our climate, and our government recognizes that, and that's why we've acted on that subset in the pillar, and will continue to on water quality and flood and drought as well. And then finally, on the nature pillar, we talk about parks and protected areas. Glad to be working on a number of initiatives on that front as well. Wild species and habitat, conservation, and forest and natural areas. So again, the energy strategy makes up one subset of a pillar in climate, and as we continue to move forward, the member will see more outcomes on the subsets in each of the 4 pillars.
Sorry, I didn't have my mic on. My apologies. The member from Wolseley.
Can the minister talk a little bit about the Navius research project? I'm not sure, what pillar this is applying to, but I understand that they've been engaged by the government to do research for the climate plan, and I'd like to know what they have done to date and how much they've been paid.
The Honorable Minister of Environment, Climate, and Parks.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank the member for the question on Navius. And essentially in 2019, an RFP was put out, and Navius was the successful bidder on the RFP to provide government with a host of information with respect to emissions reductions. And again, they were, and the scope of the work, of course, would be public in the RFP. And certainly the emissions reductions, and they focused on alternatives, like, again, we talked about electric vehicles, but geothermal heating, hydrogen, heat pumps, many other areas where they could focus in on, which would actually benefit Manitoba Hydro as well, since Manitoba Hydro was so engaged in the Dunsky report and also Pillar 1 in climate, where they can provide up-to-date information, specs, call it, if you want, on what actually will help reduce emissions by doing their thorough investigation when it comes to heat pumps and hydrogen and alike. So certainly we're looking forward to having that as part of the Pillar 1 in climate. Again, many areas where the pillars have, well, we get into tentacles and reach out and invite other experts to come to the table to provide Manitobans with the best technology as we move forward to path of net zero.
The member for Wolseley.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just going to repeat my original question. How much has Navius been paid to date?
The Honorable Minister of Environment, Climate, and Parks.
Thanks. Thanks, Mr. Chair. And we want to make sure that we provide the correct information. So would be happy to get that information to you shortly. And I didn't want to hold up the clock anymore. So if that's okay with the member, we could move on to another question and then revert back once we provide the information.
The member for Wolseley.
Will be in estimates again tomorrow. Can the minister commit to providing that information tomorrow?
The Honorable Minister of Environment, Climate, and Parks.
I can commit to providing it any time today or tomorrow, or the next day.
The member for Wolseley.
Thanks. I'll just ask the question tomorrow. Has the provincial government completely accessed funds available to them as part of the Low Carbon Economy Fund?
The Honorable Minister of Environment, Climate, and Parks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and again, thank the member for the question on the Low Carbon Economy Fund, or LCEF. Great program, started, I know, right across the country. I believe it was just pre-COVID. And certainly we were pleased to sign on at $66.8 million through the LCEF program. To date, we have spent, well, actually not us, it's through two funds actually, the Efficiency Trucking Program and Efficiency Manitoba. $38.2 million has already been spent on programming. It was about almost a year during COVID where obviously the challenges of rolling out programming, whether it be residential or industrial, we know that the world had shut down for some time. So there was a bit of a delay in continuing that fine programming that was done up. So we, along with other jurisdictions, the feds have provided an extension to go ahead and ensure that we don't lapse, and we will not, the LCEF funding. And we're looking forward to having that pool basically delivered to Manitobans by fiscal 23-24. So pretty much on track, no different than other jurisdictions. COVID threw a wrench into a lot of areas, as we all know and we all live through, and certainly we're pleased to see that Efficiency Manitoba has really ramped up now post-COVID and moving forward with the LCEF fund to ensure it gets into Manitoba's hands.
The member for Wolseley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So my understanding then is there's about $28 million not yet spent of the Low Carbon Economy Fund. The minister can correct that if I have that number wrong. And that the federal government has provided an extension into 23-24. So when is the exact expiry deadline with the extension, and where will those additional funds be spent?
The Honorable Minister of Environment, Climate, and Parks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Two-part question. First of all, by March 2024, the LCF funds will be spent. And second is a little bit longer. So again, as the member knows, departments will be going into estimates very shortly for their fiscal 22-23 fiscal years, and certainly don't want to prejudge the outcome of the department going to estimates, but I can tell the member that there will be, of course, an ask for a more casting a larger net, per se, involving municipalities, private sector, industry, to tap into the remainder of the LCF funds to help communities throughout the province and of course in Winnipeg as well. So we're looking forward to getting into estimates and moving that needle. We know we are motivated, and we will have that $28.6 million fully spent by March 2024.
The member for Wolseley.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to asking some questions about parks now. How much money has been paid to the company R8 Outdoors? I realize they also maybe go by the parent company Aspiria as part of their administration of park passes and the sale of other permits. And if the minister could outline how much the government has spent year by year since they contracted with R8 Outdoors.
The Honorable Minister of Environment, Climate, and Parks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank the member from Wolsey for the question. And just wanted to get on the record to just a little bit more background information too as well about e-licensing and how many e-licenses or permits are being generated. So Manitoba issued over 398,000 licenses and permits, generating over $10.2 million. The licensing initiative is consistent with our commitment to, again, we want to make sure we're maximizing value and ensuring that advancing in innovative technology solutions and also reducing red tape and delivering enhanced public services for Manitobans. And that's exactly what this has accomplished. Approximately 60% of e-licensing sales were made online. The online service was again greatly enhanced through public service levels and eliminated the need for pre-printing and distributing paper. I mean, people couldn't even get a license if they want to come up for a weekend, even for tourism. So obviously a great economic driver too as well for anybody wanting to come up here, either hunt or visit one of our great parks. Certainly this provided that opportunity. And again, the implementation of the new licensing system again improves collection of data, also compliance and enforcement too as well, and certainly aids in our conservation officers when they're doing their job. The question also from the member was how much was Aspire fees collected? Fees collected for fiscal 21-22, $1.329 million.
The member for Wolseley.
Thank you. I had actually asked if I could hear how much was collected year after year over the last, I believe it's been 3 years since these permits have been in use. But I appreciate getting the number for 21-22. Can the minister explain what role his government sees for private companies in the administration and operation of parks in Manitoba?
The Honorable Minister of Environment, Climate, and Parks.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank the member for the question. The member knows that for several years, parks have maintained, Manitoba Parks have maintained agreements with commercial operators in provincial parks essentially for decades. That certainly hasn't changed under our government, and certainly was that way during the former government. And it's been said many times in the House, and I believe I put it on record here last week as well, is our parks are not for sale, contrary to what the opposition would like to provide information to Manitobans. But we know that they're not, and certainly Manitoba government is working with their commercial operators to enhance that experience for Manitobans when they visit our provincial parks. Also looking at more partnerships with Indigenous folks as well. Going forward, we have parks right throughout the province, as we know, and some of them border along communities, First Nation communities, and certainly there has been a lot of discussion led by First Nations and Indigenous folks with us, a whole of government actually, through IRNR as well, on how we can continue to foster partnerships and grow together and ensure that not only are we enhancing the experience for visitors, but also enhancing a partnership with Indigenous as well. So, yeah, I think I'll leave it there. I'm sure the member from Wolseley has another question on some of the great commercial operators that have been running in our parks for decades.
The member for Wolseley.
Thank you, Chair. Can the minister talk about, well, the agreement signed with the private company in St. Ambrose Provincial Park? When my actual question previously had been about administration or operation of parks, not specifically selling off parks. But that's an example of an operation, a private operation that has been introduced under this government. Does the minister believe that this is in fact a good model and that there ought to be more of this being emulated in other areas of the province?
The Honorable Minister of Environment, Climate, and Parks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank the member for that question again. I'm sure we can all remember the, I'll call it the 300-year flood in 2011 when essentially both east and west, north and south, Lake Manitoba areas were devastated, and certainly St. Ambrose was one of those areas as well, being at the South Basin, taking that north flow, pretty much essentially wiping out the whole area. Again, I take the member back to my earlier comments about, first of all, obviously our parks are not for sale. We know that. But the member, I talked to the member about commercial operators have been there for decades operating, providing services to Manitoba park goers. And some, and often regions too as well, where really it's remote, which makes it a challenge for anybody, whether you're providing it a commercial service or even from the public side. So certainly any enhancements we can do to ensure that those parks remain open and accessible is what the focus is. And this is an important takeaway for the member as well. The government retains full administration and control over all commercial operations in all our parks.
The member for Wolseley.
Thank you, Chair. Can the minister tell this committee whether or not there will be an increase in protected areas in the province this year?
The Honorable Minister of Environment, Climate, and Parks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank the member again for the question. And on protected areas, of course, Manitoba will continue to recognize the importance of these protected areas for sure. Myself and actually my team and I were up in Yukon at Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment, CCME, in August, just this past August, and we were able to engage with many productive discussions with our territory and provincial colleagues, but also the federal minister as well, Minister Guilbeault, and we were able to carve out a little bit of time for a one-on-one with the minister too as well. And we did talk about protected areas and how important they are and how fortunate we are in Manitoba, particularly in our north, to have some great areas up there too as well. And you know, Manitoba will continue to build the network of protected conserved areas. Absolutely, this basically to conserve ecosystems and maintain biodiversity in many areas across the province. So I also wanted to put on the record too as well for the member that when we're looking at protecting protected areas, it is of the utmost importance to include discussions and partner with Indigenous folks as well. And as a matter of fact, we have met, the department and myself inclusive, 2 times already on this particular issue with Seal River, and also had a meeting recently with the Fisher River Cree Nation as well, and working with them on how we can partner on ensuring that areas within the territory are protected. So it truly is a partnership. It needs to continue to be a partnership as we go forward, and certainly we want to be leaders in Manitoba when it comes to protected areas.
The member for Wolseley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm aware of how little land in Manitoba has been protected under this government. It's actually really a tragedy over the last 6 years. And this was a significant commitment of the former government, and there was, in fact, you know, I just recently went looking for that information on the government website about that commitment, and it's disappeared now from the website. So I hear the minister saying that this is important, that he's partnering with Indigenous communities, but I'd really like to know what the targets are and what kind of commitment this government will make to increasing protected areas in this coming year, in this coming budget.
The Honorable Minister of Environment, Climate, and Parks.
Threw you off a little that time, eh? It was quick to answer. Thanks, Mr. Chair. And again, thank the member for the question, and just take back and rewind to the comment the member from Wolseley made about the former government and what their plan was. Well, I'd certainly welcome the member to provide that plan, because certainly nothing was done for 17 years under the former government. Unlike the former government, we have a plan. And that plan, as I spoke to earlier in my first answer, is ensuring that we talk about targets. The member talked about targets. Well, let's talk about targets. We won't set targets. The government won't set targets. Why would we do that alone? I guess I'm going to ask a question of the member. we need to ensure that targets are set in partnership with all the key stakeholders, including Indigenous folks, particularly in the north, where we have a vast land that needs to be protected for sure, and finding that balance in concert and lockstep with Indigenous partnership and other stakeholders that will be at the table, that are at the table, as I mentioned in my preamble, with Fisher River and Seal River and Fisher River Cree Nation, to name only two. So certainly we're on the right path, and we will continue to go down that path to ensure that we do move forward. And I know we've made a commitment to do that, and we will continue to see it through.
The member for Wolseley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do want to correct the record. The amount of land that was protected under the previous government was substantial, particularly in the last few years. And it was a commitment that was made and was followed up on. It's been less than 1% of Manitoba's land that's been protected under this government in the last 6 years. So it's a fair question to know what kind of targets are in place, and I hope the minister is aware that many Indigenous groups across the country have called on a protection of 30% of lands by the year 2030. And so it would be really good to hear that the government's even thinking about this a little bit. I'm going to ask the government again, knowing that in fact there's been this call for 30% of land protection. Does this government have any intention in the next year to protect any lands in Manitoba?
The Honorable Minister of Environment, Climate, and Parks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and again, I certainly would welcome a copy of the member statement regarding the protected areas that the member referred to under the former government. We know that certainly there was a lot of land that was essentially looked at during a number of issues, and we know that during the Bipole 3 issue, and I know the member is probably familiar with Bipole 3 and the 540 kilometers of torn up land halfway around the province to run a bipole line back to the east part of the province was certainly, if that was part of the plan, I probably was, I guess, but I don't know how they accounted for it, but they obviously did something with it. When they were pounding an east side road through protected forest and not running a hydro line down it didn't make sense. Anyways, I digress a bit. Provincial parks play a major role in protecting Manitoba's natural landscape. Manitoba has developed a draft provincial park strategy to sustain Manitoba's parks. Again, parks are going to play a massive role in how we move forward with protected spaces, protected areas. And certainly that will include, as I said in my first two responses, true partnerships, sitting around the table, ensuring that the interests of Indigenous, the interests of other stakeholders, and in partnership with the federal government as well, who is also leading the charge in protected areas, where we have open discussions and ensure that we map out a balance between protected areas, industry, stakeholders, Indigenous, of course, at the table, playing a very predominant role. So I think I'll leave it at that, and if the member still wants to go on land, I think I've got another couple of answers for her.
The member for Wolseley.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the minister might not be familiar with the concept of protected lands or the work that's happened in the past, actually, under both previous governments. Between 1990 and 2018, this province moved from 350,000 hectares to 7.2 million hectares of protected land. And then in the last 5 years of that time, in the last 5 years of the previous government, there was a really intentional push, and 2% further of land was protected. In the following 5 years, it's 2016, 0.02% of land was protected. So about 10% of what was protected in the previous 5 years was protected between 2016 to 2021. So we can talk about history all we want and what the minister thinks should or shouldn't have happened, but I just want to know, does the minister have any commitment at all to protecting more land in this coming year or in the next 5 years if he has the opportunity to do so?
The Honorable Minister of Environment, Climate, and Parks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just before I get into talking more about protected areas and how really it's a multi-pronged approach, the member had asked about the Navius contract. Year to date, a total of $92,000 has been spent. So back to protected areas. Again, as I mentioned, it's more than just land. You need to expand that way of thinking, and certainly transitioning. What our government has done is transitioned conservation districts to watershed boundaries based on ecology. So I know the member is probably familiar with that. As a matter of fact, we've expanded our watershed districts program the last 3 years in a row, even during COVID, where pretty much everything shut down. The team is still hard at work and again expanding that network to now 113 member municipalities. I'd like to say stay tuned, but I'll say more to come, because Manitobans and particularly municipalities and other districts across Manitoba are stepping up, and they understand that delivering ecological programs across working landscapes is the way to go, including, by the way, $204 million in the conservation and grow trust. So you have to, we believe anyways, that you have to look at the big picture. And certainly when we're having those discussions with the likes of Seal River and Fisher River Cree Nation and other stakeholders across the province, these are areas that come up when we talk about protected spaces, protected areas, and water plays a role. So we're certainly proud of the record that we have on both fronts, and we'll continue to forge ahead to ensure that we're protecting spaces throughout the province.
The member for Wolseley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. While we're on the topic of the importance of protecting a wide range of biodiverse areas, both land and water, one of the areas that the previous government worked to strengthen protections for was peatlands. And I know that this government in the Climate and Green Plan specifically talks about increasing protections for peatlands. And yet this most recent budget brought in, fiscal policy that's at odds with that. I would think that that there's now a financial incentive to increase peat harvesting in the province. So I know that policy doesn't fall under this minister's budget, but it is his government's budget. So I'd like to know if this minister can speak to this policy that's very much at odds with his own Climate and Green Plan commitment to protecting more peatland in the province.
The Honorable Minister of Environment, Climate, and Parks.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. And as the member noted, this particular question really falls under NRND. However, pleased to put on the record that it was our government that actually fully proclaimed the former government's Stewardship Act, Peatland Stewardship Act, back in 2020. Again, really giving us that balanced approach to obviously to the crucial landscape. So pleased to put that on the record. The bill was introduced in 2015 by the former government, and our government fully proclaimed the bill in 2020.
The member for Wolseley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe that I asked a question about if the incentives for peat harvesting are, if the minister sees these at odds with the goals of his department. I admit there was a long break there, so I almost forgot what the question was when the answer came because it didn't match. But I will say, because we're almost out of time, I just have one more question under my umbrella of parks and protected lands, so I'll ask that and see if we can possibly get it answered today. Does the minister believe that there will be any change in special permits to access polar bear areas in Churchill this year?
The Honorable Minister of Environment, Climate, and Parks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and again, I thank the member from Wolseley for a question on polar bears, and the polar bear areas that you're talking to really falls under NRND, but certainly for the record, I would love to put on the record that my colleague introduced Bill 76, the Coat of Arms Emblem Manitoba Tartan Amendment Act, which would designate the polar bear as an official provincial emblem to recognize the important role the polar bear currently plays as an internationally recognized symbol of Manitoba. Certainly, our government recognizes the importance of the polar bear to the point where now it is official coat of arms.
The hour being 5 p.m., committee rise.